When historians look back over the history of the world, they must surely look at the 20th century as the bloodiest of all centuries. I mean, we had 2 world wars. And it's estimated that during the Second World War, some 50 million people lost their lives. Then we had the Korean War after that, and after the Korean War, the Vietnam War, but hundreds of other wars in between. And today in the 21st century, more wars. However, when the Jewish people look back at their history, they must look at that dark period within the Second World War that today is called the Holocaust. Now, the persecution of the Jews in Europe began much earlier in the 1930s, but it culminated in the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children in horrible ways, in extermination ditches, in gas chambers, in other brutal ways that I dare not even mention. 1.5 million Jewish children, and we call ourselves civilized. Yet we've not found a way to stop conflict, war, and killing. How on earth can we explain the systematic murder of 6 million people of any ethnic origin? But in this case, they were Jewish people who had built lives for themselves in the nations of Europe. How do we explain all that carnage and suffering? I will try in this episode of the Prophetic Connection.
The Bible declares that the people of Israel are a chosen nation, a nation God chose above all other nations. It is also clear that God chose the Jews so they in turn could be a blessing to all nations. This means that Abraham's children were to be human channels through whom God's light and the salvation he offered could flow to all the world. In fact, it was Jesus, the most well-known of all Jews, who said that salvation was of the Jews. And surely, no other Jew before or since Jesus has influenced the course of history as much as he has done. As far as the Christian world is concerned, Jesus was and is the very means of God's salvation to the whole world. The fact that recorded history is divided into 2 parts, marked by his birth nearly 2,000 years ago, is sufficient evidence of the impact of Jesus and his lasting influence. But if Jesus as an individual Jew has influenced and blessed our world, what is the broader and collective influence of all Jews on human existence? More importantly, how has the world responded to the blessings it has received from Jewish creativity and ingenuity? Sadly, history records that the Jewish journey through time has been marked more often than not by extended periods of hardship and suffering. This means that being chosen by God does not always mean being free from pain and persecution. In fact, there were times when, because of brutal persecution, the light of Jewish influence and blessing was virtually extinguished.
You know, it's one thing to know that the Holocaust occurred, but visit a Holocaust museum and see the images. In this latest season of the Prophetic Connection, we're putting up the warning sign, warning graphic images, because we want to bring the story of the Holocaust to you in real life terms. We want you to see the images that were taken at the time, that the world has quickly forgotten just what happened not that long ago. So here and there throughout the episodes, you will see this warning graphic images. And we're not doing that to alarm you, but we need to tell and retell the story of the Holocaust. Because even though we're living in the opening decades of the 21st century, we see again that the Jewish people are being persecuted. And how close are we to another Holocaust, given the animosity, the hatred we see all over the world? The Holocaust never should have happened, but the truth is it did. And if we're not careful, it could happen again.
The fact that the Holocaust occurred in so-called 20th century Christian Europe raises serious questions about any society's ability to rise above its prejudices. Adolf Hitler's obvious hatred of Jews, his rise to political prominence in Germany during the 1920s, and his subsequent election as Chancellor in 1933 can all be seen, in retrospect, as dark omens, which preceded what historians refer to as the Holocaust. The systematic attempt to wipe out the Jewish presence in Europe. Ironically, this worst nightmare in Jewish history occurred at a time when the Jews, through successive generations, had already contributed much to Europe's well-being in many areas of human endeavor. Jewish researchers were making significant scientific and medical advancements for the benefit of civilization as a whole. But Hitler was not impressed by Jewish achievements. Instead, he was aggravated by them. His vision of Germany had no room for Jews. And if Jews had any value at all, it was as scapegoats who could be blamed for Germany's socio-economic problems. The harsh economic realities that plagued Europe in the aftermath of World War I proved to be ideal breeding grounds for Adolf Hitler's political aspirations. Germans were suffering under the burden of a costly war they had initiated and lost, while German nationalism had been struck a heavy blow. But all of this was to Hitler's advantage. He realized that if he could appeal to German pride, if he could harness the collective German consciousness, he might then seize political power. Not surprisingly, it didn't take long for Hitler's latent anti-Semitism to point an accusing finger at Germany's Jewish population as the primary reason for Germany's economic and other woes. It was the Jews, Hitler argued, who started wars in order to profit from them. That Jews were successful in many spheres of German society seemed to support Hitler's contentions. The fact that Jews lived as a distinct society within Germany also meant they could be more easily marginalized, something Hitler also used to his advantage. Of course, Hitler was not the first to recognize that Jewish biblical and cultural distinctives, while preventing the assimilation of Jews among the nations, also made them appealing scapegoats. But whatever Jews had suffered in the past would soon pale in comparison to what they would suffer during Hitler's final solution: an attempt to eradicate the Jewish nation once and for all. Hitler nearly succeeded. By the time the war ended in 1945, 1/3 of all Jews, approximately 6 million, including 1.5 million Jewish children, had been systematically murdered. But if Hitler initiated the Holocaust, how could the nations of the world allow it to continue? What had the Jewish people done to warrant their systematic mass murder? And even if it can be argued that Western nations were initially unaware that the Holocaust was taking place, why were these same nations so reluctant to accept Jewish refugees who were trying to escape the punitive measures already being enacted by the Nazis even before World War II had begun? Of course, there are even more profound questions than these. If the Jews were God's chosen people, his light bearers to the nations, then where was God during the Holocaust?
The Jewish people have struggled since the beginning. Abraham, our father, was not universally popular. He was thrown into an oven and he emerged. You know, he had to fight wars against the 5 kings. Okay, he had to chase and rescue his nephew Lot. Okay, he became a very successful man, Abraham, and had many, you know, converts and followers who came to know God through Abraham. But from that time all the way in Jewish history, this has not been an easy ride.
But if Jews had struggled under successive masters within the land of Israel, they struggled just as much beyond it, especially during periods of prolonged exile.
The Bible says explicitly that when the Jews will lose their land, as we did from Rome, when the temple was destroyed in the year 70, once we lose our land, we will go through the countries of the world. And one of the verses in Deuteronomy is, Lo yeh manoach lakaf raglechem, there will be no rest for your feet during all those years of exile. And that is in fact what happened. We had sometimes a few hundred years of stability in one country or another, but eventually that was the Torah's message to the Jewish people. There is only one place for the Jewish people, that's Israel. And you will wander, and that wandering, unfortunately, was caused by tremendous persecutions throughout history.
One of the greatest times of persecution was first at the time of Esther, when the Persian king wanted to kill all of the Jews in the Roman Empire simply because they observed a different set of laws. Fortunately, that plan was abated, and the book of Esther takes us through all of the ways in which God maneuvered through Esther and Mordecai to bring about a better result.
While it is clear that an all-powerful God allowed Jewish suffering, the biblical account makes it equally clear that there were other times when God acted to prevent or at least limit Jewish suffering. The story of Esther, as recounted in the book which bears her name, is one recorded example of God's intervention. It is also one of the first examples of obvious anti-Semitism as illustrated by the life of Haman, an influential, if Jew-hating, courtier in the service of the Persian king.
Now, already in the book of Esther, Haman comes and speaks to Ahasuerus and says, there is one people, they are different from all the people of the world. They don't hearken to the laws of the kings. They have different laws and different... let me extinguish their light. Let there be light by... That is the pathology of it. Let there be light by extinguishing the Jew.
Anti-Semitism, or the inclination to hate and persecute Jews, is evident throughout recorded history. Cross-cultural in nature, it can remain virtually dormant in one generation, only to surface with great ferocity in the next. And surprisingly, it seems to have done so more often in the so-called Christian nations than in non-Christian ones. During the Middle Ages, when the populations of Europe were ravaged by plagues caused by germ-carrying rodents, Jews were commonly accused of poisoning wells as a means of gaining social advantage. The Jewish practice of ritual hand-washing before meals, which on one hand limited Jewish exposure to germ transfer, also invited suspicion because fewer Jews were dying of disease in proportion to the general population. Here again, the scapegoat label was readily applied to the Jews. Someone had to be blamed for this calamity of untimely deaths.
Look at the Middle Ages, when Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Well, if that's true, and I'm a decent person and I want to defend my children from all this poison, then I have an obligation, even if I'm a good person, and that's how you were able to get many good people to participate in the attempts to exterminate Jews throughout history. They're poisoning the wells. They're using the blood of children for matzah. Oh my God, I've got to protect my children.
Blood libel, the practice of accusing Jews of killing Gentile children so their blood could be used for Jewish ritual feasts, such as the Passover meal, was yet another insult hurled at Jews. Jews, it was commonly believed, added Gentile children's blood to matzah, the bread eaten during the Passover celebration. But in one sense, this was simply an extension of the long-held belief that Jews were collectively responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. This perverted view of Christian history saw all Jews, living or dead, as Christ killers. Ironically, Jesus, as he was hanging from the cross, petitioned his Father to forgive all those who were crucifying him, both Jews and Gentiles. But this was a biblical and historic fact that anti-Semites were quick to ignore. Steeped as they were in willful ignorance, their hatred of Jews had no room for benevolence, much less mercy.
But traditionally, the Jew is a physical threat. He killed God. He's dangerous, which explains why throughout history so many incredibly violent accusations are leveled against the Jew. He's physically malevolent. He can kill you. He can poison your wells. The Jew is portrayed as the devil in medieval Europe. He is the devil. The devil wears the Jewish sign. He has the Jewish nose. He has the Jewish hat.
Unfortunately, people very quickly can slip into hatred, especially when these propaganda machines are successful in presenting the Jews as a threat. When the Jews can be presented as a threat to other people, to humanity, then even a good person will want them to be destroyed. Why? Because he has to defend himself. He has a right to self-defense. If the Jews were just slime and dirt, then it's not, no, you don't have to do anything. But if they're endangering the existence of humanity, then you are justified. And not only are you justified, but you, as a decent person, have an obligation to destroy those people.
The prevailing view of Jews as Christ killers also helps to explain why, during the centuries of the Christian Crusades, Jews were singled out for unspeakable brutality. While the Christian knights saw themselves as liberators of God's Holy Land, they were just as quick to see Jews having no rights at all, something they had forfeited by their killing of Christ. It is for this reason the Crusaders showed little mercy to Jews both before and after they reached Jerusalem. Many Jews were forced into synagogues that were then set on fire, even as the knights celebrated Holy Communion in belief that the killing of Jews was God's will. But if the Crusades claimed thousands of Jewish lives, the Holocaust, a millennium later, would claim millions more, proving that anti-Semitism had a long reach.
The Holocaust is not a unique, singular event, okay? It is perhaps the most outrageous and the most comprehensive and scary because it was done with modern technology and with a ruthlessness and a singleness of purpose, which, you know, perhaps these other events never had. But it's part of a chain. And, you know, we say in each and every generation, someone has come, you know, to destroy the Jews.
Today, more than ever before, it seems as though our world is at a tipping point as generation after generation slips further into chaos and darkness. Not since the days of Noah has the earth seen such decadence, immorality, and violence. But what does this mean for those who believe, and what consequences await for those who do not? As it was in the days of Noah, the DVD series of Dr. John Tweedie's 21st season of The Prophetic Connection explores the scriptures to uncover the meaning behind the signs of these troubled times. Call the number on your screen now, 1-888-206-1986, or visit C4IAmerica.com to become a new monthly partner with your gift of just $25 a month or more, and you will receive this DVD set, ideal for individuals or small group studies, along with the bi-monthly newspaper, Israel the Prophetic Connection. We're waiting to hear from you.
There is one good trend that is occurring, however, and that is that Holocaust museums are springing up all over the world in the major cities. And those museums capture the story of what happened during the Second World War to the European Jews. And their images are graphic too. And there are video rolls, and we see the piles of corpses, we see the oven doors are opened, and we see the remains of people who lived, Jewish people who lived, but whose lives were taken from them. So these museums stand as a testimony to what happened then. They record the names of the 6 million people that were lost. And we need to take the younger generation to these museums and to educate them, to touch their hearts and invade their minds in a sense, so that this will be in their minds and they will work to prevent another Holocaust occurring. We need to teach the next generation, because the propaganda machine against the Jews is in full swing. And this is one means of counteracting that evil, negative influence.
They were God's chosen children, His light bearers to the nations. For centuries they had made Europe their home. With their love of learning, they had made enormous contributions to European societies. They could count among their proportionately smaller population some of Europe's finest scholars and best musicians. Yet when anti-Semitism reared its ugly head, all they had given was quickly forgotten, and their greatest achievements could not save them. Hitler's rise to political ascendancy in 1933, coupled with his ability to capitalize on the resurgence of German nationalism, resulted in the Jews being transported to their deaths by the millions, a systematic slaughter of one ethnic segment of Europe's broader population, the Jewish problem, as Hitler called it. They saw themselves as German Jews. Hitler and his henchmen saw them as subhuman and therefore worthy of extermination. But if these educated Jews were guilty of anything, it was that they naively put too much trust in human nature. Since the Holocaust had no historic precedent, no one could have imagined such horrors were possible in what was supposed to be the 20th century civilized Europe.
One of the weirdest, and it's really a supernatural aspect of anti-Semitism, is that the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism have pretty much all taken place in places where Jews seemingly are most acceptable, most successful, and most comfortable. The classic example is Jews in Germany before the Holocaust, or Jews in Spain before the expulsion, or Jews in Poland before the Khmelnytsky massacres in the 17th century, or going all the way back in time to the Jews in Egypt 3,500 years ago, where they were doing great in Egypt, having been there for centuries.
Often Jews feel truly at home in the diaspora, but history has shown repeatedly that after a period of time, it may be 200 years, it may be 150 years, it might even be closer to 300 years, something happens and they are exiled again. Most of us today remember the Holocaust and the period of time that led up to the slaughter of roughly 6 million Jews during the period of the Nazis.
Why were the Jews, who had been part of Europe's cultural mosaic for centuries, repeatedly singled out for persecution? Why did they, more than any other ethnic group, suffer so much? Some will argue that the answer to these questions is to be found in Jewish customs and distinctiveness. The fact that the Jews were different and habitually dressed differently than the general population. Others will say it was because they were never quite free from the accusation that they were Christ killers.
You know, we've called this latest season of the Prophetic Connection, Israel, a blessing to all nations. And of course, that comes from God's promise to Abram, who became Abraham, when God said to him, I will bless you. I will make of you a great nation, and the nation that comes from you will be a blessing. That's the theme of this latest season of the Prophetic Connection. And we're doing this very deliberately to counteract all the negativity, the animosity against the Jewish people that we see in the opening decades of the 21st century. I mean, the evil propaganda machine is working overtime these days, and we can see its influence on university campuses, and in fact, at the teaching level of universities, where there is anti-Israel sentiment being taught. And it's almost a repeat of the 1930s, where the propaganda machine ramped up, and then it became a ghetto system to marginalize the Jews. University professors who were Jews lost their positions. Books that were written by Jews were burned in the open square. And then we had Kristallnacht, which was that dark night in 1938 when Jewish businesses were attacked and burned. And all of that was a result of the Nazi propaganda. So the propaganda we see today is having a similar effect. And if we don't get a hold of it, if we don't stand up against it, bad things can happen to the Jewish people. In fact, they're already happening. We would have thought that the events of October 7, 2023 would have been a wake-up call for the whole world to say, evil is once again rising up against the Jews, on that day in the form of a massacre of Israeli citizens beside the border with the Gaza Strip. Jewish people today are referring to October 7th, 2023 as the darkest day since the European Holocaust. But it can be as well a harbinger of worse things to come if people of goodwill don't rise up, if the Christian church doesn't stand up against these evil trends that we're seeing all over the world once again. Tomorrow will be too late. Today is the time for us to stand up, to stand for the Jewish people, and to do what we can to fight the propaganda that is against them. And it's part of the reason we do the prophetic connection, so people will understand God's heart for the Jewish people. He birthed this nation to begin with. He has plans and purposes for Israel that will be fulfilled in His time because He is a sovereign God. But in the meantime, we have a calling to serve Him through helping the people of Israel, this special nation that He cherishes. He's keeping His promises to them. Watch and see how the remaining prophecies are fulfilled in the days that lie ahead.
This past year has been incredibly challenging, from the attacks on Israel to the ongoing struggles faced by the Jewish people worldwide. We've seen heartache, loss, and resilience like never before. Yet in the midst of these trials, C4I has been a source of hope and support in the Holy Land, providing aid, comfort, and a tangible reminder that they are not alone. Your generosity makes this life-changing work possible. Your one-time gift of just $25 or more helps us continue this vital mission. And as a thank you for your support, you will receive the bi-monthly newspaper Israel the Prophetic Connection, filled with stories and articles keeping you informed and up to date on all that is happening in Israel. Call now, 1-888-206-1986, or visit c4iamerica.com to make your one-time donation. Together, we can make a difference for the people of Israel.